Every condemned soul has 3 deaths waiting for them in the 41st millennium. The first death is when they're branded as failures and cast into the Penal Legions. The second death comes when they realize the emperor they serve views them as expendable ammunition rather than human beings. But the third death, that's when they discover what they're truly capable of, when everything else has been stripped away. Today's story will shatter everything you think you know about redemption, loyalty, and what it really means to serve the Golden Throne. By the end, you'll question whether the greatest heresy isn't betraying the Emperor, but whether the Emperor's own servants have betrayed the very souls they were meant to protect. So hit that subscribe button now, because once this tale begins, you won't be able to look away from the darkness we're about to descend into together. The transport ships screaming through Gehenna Prime's blood-red atmosphere carried 300 souls who had already died twice. They sat in perfect, terrible silence. Not the disciplined quiet of veteran soldiers, but the hollow emptiness of the truly damned. These were the branded ones, the 47th Penal Legion, whose shaved skulls bore their failures carved in Gothic script for all eternity to witness. But here's what Imperial Command never tells you about Penal Legions. They don't send you the weak ones. They don't send you the cowards or the incompetents. Those souls get the firing squad or the labor camps. No, the Penal Legions get something far more dangerous. They get the competent ones whose only crime was retaining their humanity in a galaxy that demands its sacrifice. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood at the front of the lead transport, watching 300 faces that should have shown fear, but instead displayed something infinitely more terrifying: acceptance. His own career had been built on following orders without question, but as he studied the brands burned into these soldiers' flesh, he began to wonder if some questions deserved to be asked, regardless of the consequences. Violence against superior officer. That was Trooper Cass Mordian, whose scarred knuckles had shattered a lieutenant's jaw for ordering her squad into a kill zone while he watched from safety. Failure to advance under enemy fire. Sergeant Viktor Chenkov, who'd held a trench for 6 hours while his Commissar bled out, buying time for 2 companies to evacuate. Theft of Imperial property. Trooper Vask, whose crime had been stealing medicine for plague victims in an underhive slum. Each brand told a story that Imperial doctrine preferred to forget. Soldiers whose greatest sin had been caring more about human lives than bureaucratic convenience. Warriors whose loyalty to their comrades had exceeded their fear of military tribunals. Heroes whose only failure had been believing that the Emperor's servants should act with the same compassion they demanded others show toward the Golden Throne. But here's the secret that keeps Inquisitors awake at night. When you strip away everything from a human soul, their rank, their honor, their hope of redemption, what remains might be more dangerous than anything chaos could create. Because a soul with nothing left to lose can choose what it stands for, and that choice can shake the foundations of empires. The Vox crackled with their destination briefing: Gehenna Prime, a mining world where chaos cultists had seized control and begun converting the population. 3 regular guard regiments had already been fed into that meat grinder and emerged as casualty statistics. Now it was the condemned souls' turn to bleed for the Emperor's glory. At the transport's rear, Commissar Octavius Vex stood like a monument to absolute certainty, his bolt pistol loaded with blessed ammunition designed to ensure that even the damned would face judgment. But as he watched these branded criminals prepare for what might be their final battle, he felt something he'd never experienced in 30 years of unwavering faith: doubt. Because these souls weren't preparing to die as criminals seeking redemption. They were preparing to die as Imperial soldiers who had never stopped believing in something greater than themselves, even when that something had abandoned them to the mathematics of acceptable loss. Former tech adept Cyrus Vane's augmented senses detected 17 separate mechanical failures in his assigned lasgun, flaws that might mean death when survival depended on the Emperor's mercy and superior firepower. His crime had been trying to build better weapons for the soldiers who carried them, but innovation without permission was heresy in the eyes of the Mechanicus. The transport shuddered as it began final approach, and through the armored viewports, Gehenna Prime became visible in all its corrupted glory. What had once been green agricultural plains now writhed with vegetation that moved independently of wind, while the distant spires of Hive Golgotha glowed with the sickly light of warp fire. But the most terrifying sight wasn't the chaos corruption painting the landscape in impossible colors. It was the recognition in 300 pairs of eyes as seasoned soldiers understood exactly what kind of hell they were being dropped into, and the grim satisfaction that flickered across their faces as they realized they finally had enemies worth killing. "Emperor protects the faithful," they began to chant, their voices blending into a hymn that carried undertones of challenge rather than submission. Because faith tested by betrayal burns brighter than faith that has never been questioned, and souls that have already died twice have nothing left to fear from a third death. As the assault ramps began to lower and the corrupted soil of Gehenna Prime waited to drink their blood, each condemned soul of the 47th Penal Legion prepared to discover whether mercy could survive in a galaxy that had forgotten its meaning, or whether even the damned could find redemption when everything else had been stripped away. What happened next would challenge everything you believe about loyalty, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve the Emperor's will. But I'm warning you now, once you witness what these branded souls accomplish in the trenches of Gehenna Prime, you'll never look at Imperial justice the same way again. The assembly grounds reeked of sulfur and something worse, the sweet, cloying scent of corruption that made veteran soldiers gag and recruits vomit into their helmets. 300 convicts stood in perfect formation on the diseased earth of Gehenna Prime, their orange fatigues a stark contrast to the crimson soil that seemed to pulse with malevolent life beneath their boots. Each man and woman bore the physical testimony of their failures, carved into flesh and branded onto bone. Sergeant Viktor Chenkov's massive frame dominated the front rank, but the brand across his shaved skull told a different story than his imposing presence suggested. Failure to advance under enemy fire, 9. Gothic letters that reduced 6 hours of heroic rearguard action to a simple bureaucratic judgment. The deeper truth was written in the puckered scar tissue that covered the left side of his face, a souvenir from the plasma blast that had killed Commissar Volk and left Chenkov holding a trench line alone while his company retreated. The tribunal had called it cowardice. His men had called it salvation. 3 rows behind him, former tech adept Cyrus Vane stood with mechanical precision, though the sacred red robes of the Omnissiah had been stripped from his augmented form. His left arm was a masterwork of Imperial engineering, blessed steel and sanctified servos that could punch through ceramite with ease. But the crime branded across his scalp was simple and damning, unsanctioned experimentation. The Mechanicus didn't elaborate on charges. Vane had tried to create a better pattern lasgun, one that wouldn't fail in the crucial moment when a soldier's life depended on the Emperor's mercy and superior firepower. His reward had been exile and the promise of redemption through death. Nearby, Trooper Cass Mordian absently flexed her scarred knuckles while studying the twisted landscape around them. Her brand read, "Violence against superior officer," but the full story was more complex. Lieutenant Garin had ordered her squad to advance across open ground while enemy heavy bolters swept the killing field. When she'd suggested an alternate route through the ruins, he'd backhanded her in front of the entire platoon. Her response had been swift and permanent: 3 broken ribs, a shattered jaw, and a medical discharge for Garin. court-martial and penal service for Mordian. The brands were everywhere, a catalogue of human weakness stamped in flesh. Desertion in the face of the enemy marked the skull of former Corporal Hayes, who had carried wounded civilians to safety instead of holding his position during the massacre of Tertius VII. Theft of Imperial property adorned Trooper Vask, whose crime had been stealing medical supplies for a plague-stricken underhive district. Conduct unbecoming was the vague charge that had condemned Sergeant Mills, whose only sin had been questioning orders that sent his men to die in an obviously compromised position. But it was the brands marked heresy that drew the most attention and the most fear. These were not the obvious cases. Those souls would have faced the pyre or the executioner's blade. These were the borderline cases, men and women whose loyalty had wavered for just a moment under impossible circumstances. Former Medici Jorik Thane bore such a mark, his crime nothing more than expressing doubt about the Emperor's divine nature while treating casualties during a demon incursion. Trooper Yeshua Kane's heretical act had been even simpler. He had wept while burning a village of possessed civilians, showing weakness in the face of righteous duty. Colonel Thorne walked slowly through the ranks, his experienced eye cataloguing the human wreckage under his command. These weren't green recruits or broken veterans. These were skilled soldiers whose only crime had been retaining their humanity in a galaxy that demanded its sacrifice. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Imperium spent decades training these men and women to be perfect soldiers, then discarded them the moment they proved they were still human beings. Commissar Vex stood at the formation's edge, his bolt pistol gleaming in the sickly light of Gehenna Prime's corrupted sun. To him, these brands represented opportunity rather than tragedy. Each scar was a reminder of failure, and failure could be transformed into fanatical devotion with the right motivation. Fear of damnation was a powerful tool, and Vex wielded it like a master craftsman. "Look upon your brothers and sisters," Vex commanded, his voice carrying across the silent ranks. "Each of you bears the mark of your shame, but today those marks become your strength. You know the weight of failure. You understand the price of weakness. And because of that knowledge, you will fight harder than any Guard regiment fresh from the training grounds of Cadia or Catechism." Former Psyker Lydia Voss stood in the back ranks, her once shaved head now showing the first stubble of grey hair. Her brand was the most feared of all, unsanctioned Psyker, though her crime had been involuntary. When her psychic abilities had manifested during a Tyrannid assault on her homeworld, she had accidentally incinerated 3 fellow guardsmen along with the Genestealers that threatened to overrun their position. The black ships had come for her, but bureaucratic error had sent her to penal service instead of the Scholastica Sicana. She kept her abilities tightly controlled now, buried beneath layers of mental conditioning and pure terror of what might happen if she lost control again. The assembly continued as Thorne read from the scroll of names, each convict stepping forward to receive their equipment and assignment. Laser guns that had seen better decades, flak armor that bore the scorch marks of previous owners' deaths, and ammunition packs that might explode rather than fire when the moment of truth arrived. This was the Imperium's way. Even in seeking redemption, the condemned were given tools barely adequate for survival. Tech Adept Vane accepted his weapon with the practiced efficiency of his former calling, though his augmented senses immediately detected 17 separate mechanical flaws in the lasgun's construction. He could fix most of them, given time and proper tools, but time was a luxury the Penal Legions were never granted, and proper tools were reserved for soldiers the Imperium expected to survive. As the sun reached its zenith over the poisoned landscape, casting twisted shadows from the corrupted vegetation that seemed to writhe with predatory hunger, each convict understood the mathematics of their situation. They were expendable assets, human ammunition fired at problems too dangerous or costly for regular Imperial forces. Their brands marked them as failures, but their skills marked them as useful failures. The difference between the two definitions would determine who lived to see tomorrow's dawn and who became just another casualty statistic in the Imperium's endless ledgers of acceptable loss. Commissar Octavius Vex stood like a monolith of Imperial doctrine against the crimson sky, his black greatcoat unmarked by the ash that fell like grey snow across the staging area. In his left hand, he held the uplifting primer, that sacred text which transformed frightened humans into faithful soldiers. In his right, his bolt pistol caught the dying light, its blessed ammunition ready to deliver the Emperor's final judgment to any soul foolish enough to falter in their duty. "Gather close, condemned souls," Vex commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Before you face the heretics' blade, you will hear the Emperor's truth. You will understand why your deaths have meaning, even if your lives have been found wanting." The 300 convicts of the 47th Penal Legion formed a rough semicircle around their commissar, their orange fatigues making them look like prisoners attending their own execution, which, Vex reflected with grim satisfaction, was precisely what they were. The beauty of the Penal Legions lay in their mathematical clarity. Every death served the Emperor's purpose, whether through victory against his enemies or through the simple act of absorbing bullets meant for worthier soldiers. "You have been branded as failures," Vex began, opening the primer to a well-worn page. "Cowards, heretics, thieves, murderers. The Imperium has judged you and found you lacking. But the Emperor's mercy is infinite, and even the damned may find redemption through service." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces. Some showed fear, others resignation, but a few, the truly dangerous ones, showed something approaching hope. Former tech adept Cyrus Vane listened with the analytical precision that had once made him valuable to the Omnissiah. Vex's rhetoric followed predictable patterns: establish superiority, acknowledge their current state, offer the possibility of transformation, then gradually increase the pressure until compliance became the only rational choice. It was effective psychology, refined through 10 millennia of Imperial doctrine. But Vane could also detect the subtle falsehoods woven through the truth, the careful omissions that made redemption seem achievable when statistics suggested otherwise. "The Emperor protects the faithful," Vex continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of liturgical recitation. "But faith must be proven through action. Words are wind, prayers are merely breath, but blood is the currency of salvation. Each heretic you kill buys back a piece of your damned soul. Each moment you stand firm against the enemy's assault proves your loyalty to the Golden Throne." Trooper Cass Mordian shifted uncomfortably as memories surfaced unbidden. She'd heard similar speeches before, on Vrax, where commissars had sent waves of convict soldiers against chaos positions that regular troops couldn't assault without crippling losses. The mathematics were simple. Penal legionnaires were replaceable, while veteran guardsmen represented decades of training investment. She'd survived Vrax through luck and skill, only to end up here through her own inability to accept orders that served politics rather than tactical sense. "But make no mistake," Vex's voice hardened, taking on the edge that preceded summary executions. "Redemption is not guaranteed. It must be earned through suffering, through sacrifice, through the willing embrace of death in the Emperor's name. Those who falter, who show weakness, who allow fear to govern their actions, they will find no mercy from me. My bolt pistol carries 17 rounds, each one blessed by the ecclesiarchy, each one capable of sending a coward's soul to the judgment it deserves." Former Sergeant Viktor Chenkov watched the Commissar with the professional assessment of a career soldier. Vex was competent but predictable, following standard doctrinal approaches without the flexibility that kept commissars alive in extended campaigns. His uniform was too clean, his boots too polished, his rhetoric too textbook perfect. This was a man who had learned about war from manuals rather than trenches, and such men made dangerous mistakes when reality intruded upon theory. The heretics of Gehenna Prime have embraced corruption, Vex continued, consulting his data slate for tactical details he'd memorized days ago. They worship false gods, practice forbidden rituals, and corrupt the innocent with their blasphemous presence. Some of you may think them human beings deserving of mercy. You would be wrong. They have forfeited their humanity the moment they turned from the Emperor's light. They are abominations wearing human faces, cancer cells in the body of mankind, parasites that must be burned out with holy fire. In the back ranks, former Medici Jorik Thane felt his stomach clench at the familiar rhetoric. He'd heard the same words on Belial 4, where his medical unit had been ordered to deny treatment to captured Chaos cultists. The fact that most of those cultists had been terrified civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time had been deemed irrelevant to Imperial doctrine. His moment of heretical doubt had come while watching a 12-year-old girl die from easily treatable wounds, forbidden medical aid because someone had carved a chaos symbol into her forehead while she'd been unconscious. "You will advance when ordered," Vex declared, his bolt pistol now in his hand, though he hadn't consciously drawn it. "You will hold when commanded. You will die when necessary. And through these acts of perfect obedience, you will transform your shame into glory, your cowardice into courage, your heresy into faith. The Emperor's grace flows through disciplined action, not through individual thought or personal conscience." Former Psyker Lydia Voss felt the familiar tingle at the base of her skull that signaled psychic pressure building in the area. The warp was thin here on Gehenna Prime, and emotions had weight beyond the merely psychological. Vex's fervent faith created ripples in the Imperium, but so did the barely suppressed anger and despair of 300 condemned souls. She forced her breathing to remain steady, using techniques learned in childhood to prevent her abilities from manifesting. The last thing anyone needed was an unsanctioned psyker losing control during a commissar's sermon. "Some of you will not survive this campaign," Vex concluded, returning his bolt pistol to its holster with practiced precision. "Most of you, if we're honest. But death in the Emperor's service cleanses all sins, washes away all failures, transforms even the most cowardly criminal into a martyr worthy of remembrance. Your brands mark you as failures in life. Let your deaths mark you as successes in service." The Commissar closed his primer with a sharp snap that echoed across the silent formation. "We advance at first light. Use the remaining hours to prepare your souls, clean your weapons, and make peace with whatever gods you pray to. Because tomorrow, you will discover whether the Emperor's mercy extends to the damned, or whether mercy itself is just another casualty of war." As the convicts dispersed to their assigned positions, Commissar Vex remained standing in the gathering dusk, his eyes fixed on the distant spires of Hive Golgotha. In 8 years of service with Penal Legions, he'd delivered variations of this same speech to thousands of condemned souls. Less than 10% had survived to earn official redemption. But the remainder had served their purpose, absorbing enemy fire and revealing defensive positions that proper Imperial forces could exploit. It was, he reflected, a mathematically elegant system. Even failure could be transformed into victory if properly managed. Dawn came to Gehenna Prime like a wound bleeding light across poisoned earth. The 47th Penal Legion advanced in ragged columns through what had once been fertile agricultural plains, now transformed into a nightmare landscape where the very ground seemed to hunger for the blood of the living. Twisted trees reached toward the crimson sky with branches that moved independently of any wind. their bark weeping substances that glowed with unnatural phosphorescence. Colonel Thorne moved with the practiced efficiency of a veteran officer, but his eyes betrayed the unease that gnawed at his gut. In 20 years of Imperial service, he'd seen chaos corruption before. The way it turned familiar terrain into alien hellscapes. The way it made reality itself unreliable. But Gehenna Prime felt different, more actively malevolent, as if some vast intelligence was watching their approach and finding it amusing. "Sir," Sergeant Chenkov's voice carried the subtle tension of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts above doctrine. "The Auspex readings are wrong." Thorne studied the scanner's display, frowning at the data that made no tactical sense. According to the machine spirit's calculations, they were walking through empty plains with scattered vegetation. But his eyes showed him forests of bone-white trees whose trunks pulsed like massive arteries, while fungal growths the size of hab-blocks sprouted from soil that bubbled and hissed when disturbed. Either the Auspex was malfunctioning, or reality itself had become negotiable on this world. "Keep the men moving," Thorne ordered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "And tell them to trust their eyes, not their instruments." The column stretched for nearly a kilometer across the corrupted landscape, 300 souls in orange fatigues carrying laser guns that might fire true when their lives depended on it. Former tech adept Vane had managed to repair 17 weapons during the night march, his augmented hands working with mechanical precision in the darkness. But even blessed by the Omnissiah's knowledge, Imperial technology could only achieve so much reliability when manufactured by slave labor on forge worlds, where quality control meant executing every 10th worker. Trooper Mordian moved near the column's center, her experienced eye cataloging the tactical nightmare unfolding around them. The twisted vegetation provided countless concealment positions for enemy forces, while the unstable ground made rapid maneuver nearly impossible. Worse, the very air seemed thick with malign influence. She could taste corruption on her tongue, feel it crawling beneath her skin like insects seeking entry to her soul. "This ain't natural," muttered Corporal Hayes, the desertion brand on his skull gleaming with sweat. "Trees don't grow in spirals, and flowers don't track your movement with petals that look like bloody eyes." "Nothing's natural anymore," replied Trooper Vask, adjusting his grip on a laser gun that had already misfired twice during weapons checks. "Chaos don't follow the rules we learned in basic training." The conversation died as Commissar Vex materialized beside them with the silent precision of a hunting predator. His bolt pistol remained holstered, but his presence alone was enough to restore discipline to the ranks. Fear of the enemy might be abstract, but fear of summary execution was immediate and personal. "Save your breath for fighting," Vex commanded quietly. "And remember, doubt is the first step toward damnation. The Emperor's light burns away all corruption, but only for those whose faith remains pure." As the morning progressed, the landscape grew increasingly hostile. The very plants seemed aware of their passage, flowers turning to track their movement, vines reaching out to snag equipment and clothing, grass that whispered in languages that hurt to hear. Former Psyker Voss felt the psychic pressure building like a storm front in her mind, the warp's influence growing stronger with every kilometer they advanced toward the primary objective. It was Tech Adept Vane who first noticed the architectural impossibilities ahead. His augmented eyes could process visual data with machine precision, allowing him to detect the subtle wrongness that human perception might overlook. The ruins emerging from the twisted vegetation followed geometric patterns that violated basic principles of structural engineering. Walls that curved in directions that shouldn't exist, doorways that seemed larger from the outside than the inside, towers that cast shadows pointing toward multiple suns. Pre-Age of Strife construction, Vane reported to Colonel Thorne, though his voice carried uncertainty that his mechanical components couldn't entirely suppress. But the architectural patterns don't match any known human design philosophy. Some of these angles, they shouldn't be possible with conventional three-dimensional geometry. Thorne studied the ruins through magnoculars, noting the way they seemed to shift subtly when observed directly. The structures had clearly been human once. He could make out the familiar imperial eagle carved into what might have been a cathedral's facade. But centuries of chaos influence had transformed the settlement into something that belonged in a madman's fever dream. Movement in the ruins, Sergeant Chenkov reported, his laser gun already aimed toward the distant structures. Can't get a clear count, but there's definitely hostile contacts taking positions. The first shot came from a sniper's nest that couldn't have existed a moment before. A bell tower that Thorne was certain hadn't been there when he'd last looked. The last beam punched through Trooper Garrick's chest with surgical precision, dropping the former smuggler to the corrupted earth, where his blood began to steam and bubble upon contact with the soil. "Contact front!" Chenkov bellowed, his voice carrying the authority of battlefield experience. "Multiple positions, estimated platoon strength." The 47th Penal Legion's response was immediate but chaotic. 300 convicts dove for whatever cover the twisted landscape provided, their training overriding fear as muscle memory took control. Las fire began to snap back and forth across the killing ground, though the enemy positions seemed to shift and blur whenever directly targeted. Former Medici Thane crawled toward the fallen trooper, his medical training demanding action despite the tactical situation. But when he reached Garrick's body, he discovered something that made his enhanced understanding of human anatomy rebel in horror. The wound was healing, not with Imperial medical technology or even chaos regeneration, but with something that resembled plant growth. Tiny vines were already sprouting from the entry point, weaving themselves through damaged tissue with purposeful intelligence. "Emperor's mercy," Thane whispered, backing away from the transforming corpse. "The ground, it's taking him." As if responding to his observation, the corrupted soil began to writhe around Garrick's body, pulling it downward while the vines continued their grisly work. Within moments, the trooper had vanished entirely, leaving only a patch of earth that pulsed with the rhythm of a massive heartbeat. The enemy fire intensified, and Colonel Thorne realized they were facing something far worse than simple chaos cultists. These ruins weren't just fortified positions. They were alive, actively participating in the battle with alien intelligence. The very ground beneath their feet had become an enemy, ready to claim any who fell and transform them into something unrecognizable. "Advance by sections!" Thorne shouted over the last fire. "We can't stay here. The earth itself is compromised." But as the 47th Penal Legion began their assault on the impossible ruins, each convict understood that they were no longer fighting just for redemption or the Emperor's glory. They were fighting for the right to die as human beings, rather than be absorbed into whatever malevolent ecosystem Gehenna Prime had become. The first casualty wasn't the youngest or the weakest. It was veteran Sergeant Korvek, a 20-year man whose brand read, "Conduct unbecoming for questioning orders," that had sent his platoon into a tyrannid feeding pit. His experience should have kept him alive, but experience meant nothing when the enemy operated by rules that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Korvek had taken point for 3rd Squad's advance toward the twisted cathedral when the ground beneath his boots simply opened like a mouth lined with crystalline teeth. The veteran's scream cut through the last fire as he plunged into darkness, his voice echoing from depths that shouldn't exist in ordinary soil. Then came the wet, grinding sounds, the noise of bone being processed by something that had evolved to digest more than flesh. "Sergeant down!" Trooper Vask shouted, but his voice carried the hollow tone of a man stating the obvious. There would be no retrieval, no last rites, no body to burn on a pyre of sacred oils. Korvek had simply vanished into Gehenna Prime's hungry earth, another data point in the mathematics of acceptable loss. Former tech adept Vane processed the tactical implications with mechanical precision, while his augmented hands worked to clear a jam in his lasgun's firing mechanism. The enemy wasn't just using the terrain as cover, the terrain was the enemy. Every tactical doctrine he'd studied assumed solid ground beneath a soldier's feet, but that assumption had become obsolete the moment they'd set foot on this corrupted world. Pattern recognition suggests coordinated intelligence, Vane reported to Colonel Thorne over the squad Vox link. The ground attacks are synchronized with enemy sniper fire, creating kill zones that funnel our movement into predetermined positions. Thorne absorbed the information while diving behind a boulder that might have been natural stone or might have been fused bone. On Gehenna Prime, the distinction had become meaningless. His chainsword hummed with barely contained violence as he studied the ruins ahead, trying to identify firing positions that kept shifting like mirages in desert heat. How do we fight an enemy that controls the very ground we stand on? He wondered aloud, then immediately regretted showing doubt in front of the men. Leadership meant projecting confidence even when confidence was a luxury no rational mind could afford. The answer came from an unexpected source. Former Psyker Lydia Voss had been fighting to keep her abilities suppressed since planetfall, but the increasing warp pressure was making control nearly impossible. When Trooper Chen stepped on what looked like solid earth and found himself sinking into substance that moved like quicksand but glowed with bioluminescent patterns, her psychic senses detected the predatory intelligence guiding the attack. "There!" she shouted, pointing toward a cluster of trees whose bark pulsed with neural activity. "The network hub, it's coordinating the ground attacks through underground root systems." Her outburst violated every protocol regarding unsanctioned psychers, but desperation had overridden caution. Commissar Vex heard her words and immediately understood their implications. Either she was a witch whose very existence demanded immediate execution, or she was their only hope of surviving the next 10 minutes. The bolt pistol appeared in his hand with practiced efficiency, its muzzle tracking toward Voss with mechanical precision. But before he could squeeze the trigger, another section of ground opened beneath Second Squad's position, swallowing Corporals Ming and Velasco before they could even scream. The tactical situation had moved beyond ideological purity. They needed every advantage available, regardless of doctrinal concerns. "You will guide our fire," Vex commanded Voss, his voice tight with the strain of choosing pragmatism over faith. "But understand this. The moment we no longer need your abilities, my bolt pistol will remind you of the price of unsanctioned sorcery." Voss nodded, relief and terror warring in her expression as she allowed her psychic senses to expand. The warp signature of Gehenna Prime hit her consciousness like a physical blow, layers of corruption stretching back centuries, human souls twisted into forms that served alien purposes, and underneath it all, something vast and patient that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "The trees!" she gasped, fighting to maintain mental barriers against the psychic storm. "They're not individual organisms. They're sensory organs for something much larger. Underground, there's a network of, I don't know what to call it, living circuitry, biological processes that can think and plan and coordinate attacks." Sergeant Chenkov absorbed the information with the pragmatic acceptance of a career soldier. Whether the intelligence guiding their enemies was human, xenos, or demonic was irrelevant. It could be killed, and therefore it would be killed. The only question was methodology. "Concentrated fire on the hub trees," he ordered his squad, though his voice carried the grim certainty of a man who understood the mathematics of their situation. "If we can sever the connections, Maybe the ground attacks will become random instead of coordinated. The 47th Penal Legion's response was immediate and devastating. 300 lasguns opened fire on the cluster of neural trees that Voss had identified, their focused beams punching through bark that screamed when wounded. The trees writhed like wounded animals, their branches lashing at empty air, while ichor that glowed with unnatural colors poured from dozens of impact craters. The effect was immediate and horrifying. As the neural network took damage, the coordinated ground attacks became spasmodic and random. But the dying trees' death throes created new problems. Their root systems began to thrash like massive serpents, creating trenches and barriers that transformed the battlefield into an ever-shifting maze of obstacles. Former Medici Thane watched in fascination as the wounded vegetation exhibited responses that violated every principle of botany he'd studied. These weren't plants in any meaningful sense. They were organs of something larger, components of a distributed intelligence that might stretch across the entire continent. Destroying the hub might have disrupted local coordination, but it had also attracted the attention of whatever vast mind controlled this biological network. "Movement from the cathedral!" Trooper Mordian shouted, her scarred hands steady on her lasgun despite the chaos erupting around them. "Human contacts, but they're moving wrong." The figures emerging from the twisted ruins had once been human, but centuries of chaos corruption had transformed them into something that belonged in a Xenos biologist's worst nightmares. They moved with fluid grace that violated human joint limitations, their limbs bending in directions that suggested additional bones or entirely different skeletal structures. But most disturbing were their faces, still recognizably human, but marked with expressions of religious ecstasy as they welcomed the pain that should have been agony. "Heretics!" Commissar Vex roared, his bolt pistol barking as explosive rounds tore through corrupted flesh. "Remember your training. They may look human, but they have forfeited that right through their blasphemous choices." The enemy charged across ground that supported their weight perfectly, while remaining treacherous for Imperial forces, their corrupted forms moving with inhuman coordination. Some carried weapons that might have been lace guns once, though modifications involving living tissue had transformed them into organs that fired projectiles made of crystallized pain. Others wielded blades that cut through both flesh and spirit, leaving wounds that continued bleeding long after the physical damage should have healed. As the battle reached its crescendo, with lasfire and screams creating a symphony of violence under Gehenna Prime's bloody sun, each surviving member of the 47th Penal Legion began to understand the true scope of their situation. They hadn't been sent to fight chaos cultists. They'd been sent to fight an entire world that had been transformed into a single, malevolent organism. And that organism was very, very hungry. The heretics came in waves that defied military logic, their corrupted forms moving with the synchronized precision of insects in a hive. But the 47th Penal Legion had learned hard lessons in their first minutes on Gehenna Prime. Trust nothing, expect everything, and make every shot count because ammunition was finite while the enemy seemed endless. Former Sergeant Viktor Chenkov had claimed the ruins of what might have been a grain silo, its twisted metal providing cover while its elevated position offered clear fields of fire. His lasgun spoke with the methodical rhythm of a veteran who understood that panic was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. Each shot found its mark, punching through corrupted flesh with the satisfaction of a craftsman perfecting his trade. "Third Squad, establish overlapping fire zones," he commanded over the Vox, his voice cutting through the battle's din with practiced authority. "Don't let them mass for another charge. Keep them dispersed and bleeding." Below him, the battlefield had transformed into a hellscape of overlapping trenches and barriers created by the dying neural trees' root systems. The 47th was learning to use the terrain's instability as an advantage. If the ground was unreliable for everyone, then superior tactics and veteran instincts could still tip the balance. Trooper Cass Mordian had found herself a firing position behind a barrier of fused bone and metal, her scarred hands steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The enemy's weapons fired projectiles that screamed as they traveled, but screaming ammunition was still subject to ballistics and cover. Her return fire was precise and economical, every beam aimed at center mass, every shot intended to drop an enemy permanently. "They're learning," she reported to Chenkov over the squad channel. "Second wave is using cover better than the first. Whatever's controlling them is adapting to our tactics." The observation was correct and terrifying. The initial heretic assault had been straightforward, corrupted humans charging across open ground while relying on their supernatural resilience to absorb casualties. But the second wave moved with tactical awareness that suggested military training, using the terrain's new obstacles to mask their approach, while coordinating fire support from positions that shouldn't have existed moments before. Former tech adept Vane had established himself in what remained of a water treatment facility, his augmented senses allowing him to track multiple targets simultaneously. His laser gun had been modified during the night march. Blessed oils applied to focusing crystals, power cells recalibrated for maximum output, firing mechanism adjusted for the precise tolerances that separated life from death in infantry combat. "Pattern analysis suggests command hierarchy," he reported over the command frequency. "The heretics aren't operating as individuals. There's coordinated movement suggesting battlefield communication and tactical doctrine." Colonel Thorne absorbed the information while orchestrating the regiment's defense from a crater that had been a fountain until the neural tree's death throes had reshaped the local geography. His chainsword remained undrawn. Close combat would come later, when ammunition ran low and the enemy closed to melee range. For now, his role was coordination and leadership, maintaining unit cohesion when every instinct screamed for individual survival. "All squads, conserve ammunition," he ordered over the regimental frequency. "Aimed shots only. We can't resupply until this position is secured." The truth was darker than his words suggested. There would be no resupply regardless of tactical outcome. The 47th Penal Legion was expendable ammunition fired at a problem too dangerous for regular Imperial forces. Their success would be measured not in objectives secured, but in intelligence gathered and enemy strength revealed for follow-up operations by troops whose lives actually mattered to Imperial command. Commissar Vex had positioned himself where he could observe the entire regiment's performance, his bolt pistol loaded with specially blessed ammunition designed to ensure that no soul would escape judgment when courage failed. But as the battle progressed, he found himself impressed despite doctrinal expectations. These condemned souls were fighting with skill and determination that regular guard regiments would struggle to match. "Steady in the ranks!" he shouted over the last fire, his voice carrying the authority of absolute faith. "The Emperor's light burns away all corruption, but only for those who stand firm in their duty." The third wave brought new horrors. Heretics whose flesh had been modified to carry living weapons, their arms transformed into appendages that could fire organic projectiles with devastating accuracy. Others had been surgically altered to serve as mobile platforms for heavier weapons, their spines replaced with mechanisms that turned their entire torso into a firing mount for what looked like modified heavy bolters. Former Psyker Lydia Voss felt the psychic pressure building as more corrupted souls entered the battlefield. Each heretic carried a fragment of the greater intelligence controlling them, and their combined presence was creating a warp resonance that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. But her earlier success in identifying the neural network hub had earned her a reprieve from immediate execution, and she was determined to prove her worth before Commissar Vex decided her usefulness had expired. "The weapons," she gasped, fighting to maintain mental barriers against the psychic storm. "They're not just modified. They're alive. Symbiotic organisms that bond with corrupted nervous systems. The heretics aren't carrying weapons. They've become weapons." The observation explained the enemy's impossible accuracy and coordination. Traditional combat doctrine assumed human limitations: reflexes, endurance, ammunition capacity. But when the soldiers themselves had been transformed into living weapons systems, those limitations became irrelevant. Trooper Hayes, his desertion brand gleaming with sweat and blood from a grazing wound, found himself defending a position alongside men he'd never met, but whose criminal histories he could read branded on their skulls. Theft, murder, cowardice, heresy, a catalogue of human weakness that should have made them unreliable in combat. Instead, they fought with the desperate courage of souls who understood that this might be their only chance at redemption. "Running low on power packs," reported Corporal Mills, his conduct unbecoming brand marking him as another officer whose crime had been caring more about his men than his career. "At current rate of fire, we've got maybe 10 minutes before we're down to bayonets and harsh language." The ammunition situation was becoming critical across the entire regiment. Imperial Logistics had provided each convict with 2 power packs, enough for a standard engagement, but insufficient for the sustained firefight that Gehenna Prime had become. Soon, they would be reduced to melee combat against enemies whose flesh had been modified for close-quarters lethality. As the fourth wave of heretics began their assault, moving through the transformed terrain with inhuman grace while their living weapons discharged volleys of screaming ammunition, the survivors of the 47th Penal Legion prepared for the close combat that would determine whether their deaths would have meaning beyond simple mathematics. The screaming trenches of Gehenna Prime were about to become intimate with blood, and the condemned souls of the Penal Legion would discover whether redemption was possible when mercy itself had become another casualty of endless war. The sky above Gehenna Prime split like rotten fruit, spilling fire and twisted metal across the battlefield in a meteoric streak that ended in catastrophic impact 50 meters from the 47th's defensive positions. The crash shook the corrupted earth with seismic force, throwing fighters from both sides to the ground, while a pillar of smoke and flame reached toward the blood-red heavens like a prayer made of destruction. "What in the Emperor's name?" Colonel Thorne's words died as the smoke cleared, revealing not the expected orbital debris but something far more significant: the angular hull plating, the distinctive battle damage patterns. The ceramite armor scarred by weapons that could crack planets. This was Astartes' war gear, and it had fallen from the sky like a broken angel. The figure that crawled from the smoking crater moved with mechanical precision, despite wounds that would have killed a normal human 3 times over. Power armor the color of midnight blue bore the crossed keys symbol of the Ultramarines, though the sacred ceramite was cracked and bleeding fluids that hissed when they touched the corrupted soil. One arm hung useless, the shoulder joint shattered by impacts from weapons designed to kill gods. But the Space Marine's remaining hand still gripped a bolt pistol, and his voice carried the authority of 2 centuries fighting humanity's enemies. "Imperial forces," the Astartes spoke, his vox grill crackling with damage that couldn't quite disguise the superhuman strength beneath. "Brother Sergeant Cassius, 3rd Company, Ultramarines Chapter, status report." The words hit the 47th Penal Legion like a physical blow. These condemned souls had spent their entire military careers hearing stories of the Emperor's angels of death, superhuman warriors who knew no fear and accepted no defeat. To see one broken and bleeding, crawling from wreckage like any mortal soldier, shattered assumptions that had sustained Imperial faith for 10 millennia. Former Sergeant Chenkov responded with the automatic precision of military discipline, though his voice carried undertones of disbelief. 47th Penal Legion, sir. 300 souls under Colonel Thorne, engaged with chaos heretics in the ruins ahead. We've taken significant casualties, but are holding position. Cassius processed the information while conducting tactical assessment through sensors that still functioned despite massive system damage. His enhanced senses detected the warp corruption saturating the battlefield, the biological modifications that had transformed local vegetation into weapons, and most disturbing of all, the psychic resonance suggesting demonic influence at levels that threatened reality itself. "Penal Legion," he repeated, and even through his damaged Vox system, something like respect colored his words. "You stand against corruption that has destroyed entire planetary defense forces. The Emperor's light burns bright in unexpected souls." Trooper Mordian felt something crack inside her chest. Not ribs or sternum, but the bitter cynicism that had sustained her through court-martial and condemnation. She'd never expected to hear an Astartes speak of penal troops with anything approaching admiration, but here was a space marine acknowledging their courage in the face of impossible odds. The heretic assault intensified as if responding to the Astartes' presence. Corrupted humans emerged from positions that violated three-dimensional geometry, their modified weapons discharging volleys of ammunition that screamed with the voices of the damned. But now they faced not just condemned guardsmen, but a space marine whose centuries of experience had been earned in battles that made Gehenna Prime look like a training exercise. Cassius moved with inhuman grace despite his wounds, his bolt pistol speaking with the measured rhythm of a craftsman who understood that every round was blessed by the chapter's tech marines and capable of sending demon princes back to the warp. Each shot found its mark with precision that defied human capability, explosive bolts detonating inside corrupted flesh with results that painted the twisted landscape in colors that had no names. "Form! On the Astartes!" Colonel Thorne commanded, recognizing opportunity when it presented itself. "Overlapping fields of fire. Protect his flanks while he advances." The 47th responded with discipline that surprised even their own officers. These branded criminals moved like veteran guard regiments, their laser guns providing covering fire, while the Space Marine carved a path through enemy positions with methodical efficiency. Former thieves and deserters fought like heroes, protecting an angel of death whose presence transformed their penal service into something approaching crusade. But it was tech adept Vane who noticed the disturbing details that human perception might overlook. Cassius's wounds weren't healing with the supernatural resilience that Astartes' physiology typically provided. The ceramite armor showed battle damage from weapons that shouldn't exist in real space, energy patterns that violated physics, projectile impacts from ammunition made of crystallized emotions, scoring from blades that cut through both matter and spirit. "Brother Sergeant," Vane reported over the tactical frequency, his augmented voice carrying mechanical precision. "Your injuries show signs of warp contamination. The corruption is interfering with your enhanced healing factors." Cassius acknowledged the observation with a grunt that conveyed volumes about Space Marine pragmatism. He'd suspected as much. The battle that had brought down his Thunderhawk had involved enemies whose very existence challenged Imperial understanding of warfare. Demons wearing the faces of fallen Astartes, weapons that fired ammunition made from harvested souls, and worst of all, corruption that could affect even the Emperor's chosen warriors. "How long?" he asked, though his bolt pistol never stopped firing as he spoke. "Without medical intervention, perhaps 1 hour before system failure," Vane replied with the clinical detachment that had made him valuable to the Mechanicus before his unsanctioned experimentation. "With proper treatment, the corruption patterns suggest no available cure within Imperial medical doctrine." The words carried implications that every veteran understood. Space Marines were designed to be functionally immortal, barring catastrophic injury or overwhelming enemy action. to see one dying from wounds that mortal soldiers might survive challenged everything the 47th had believed about Imperial superiority and the Emperor's protection. Former Medici Thane had been treating wounded throughout the engagement, but approached the fallen Astartes with reverence that bordered on religious awe. His medical training had included theoretical instruction on Space Marine physiology, though he'd never expected to apply that knowledge in field conditions while under enemy fire. "Let me examine the wounds," Thane requested, though his voice carried the hesitation of a man asking permission to touch living legend. "I may not be able to cure warp corruption, but I can at least stabilize the hemorrhaging." Cassius submitted to examination with the patient endurance that marked Astartes who had served for centuries. His enhanced senses detected the brand on Thane's skull. Heresy burned in Gothic script, but also recognized the skill and genuine concern in the former Medici's hands. "Your crime?" Cassius asked, while Thane worked to seal the worst bleeding with battlefield dressings designed for normal human physiology. "I questioned the Emperor's divine nature while treating casualties from a demon incursion," Thane replied honestly. "Watching good soldiers die while forbidden to save them made me doubt things that should not be doubted." The Space Marine's response surprised every soul within hearing range. "Doubt is not heresy, mortal. Certainty without questioning is the path to stagnation." The Emperor himself was a man of science before his ascension to godhood. As the battle raged around them, with condemned criminals fighting to protect a wounded angel of death, while chaos heretics pressed their assault with inhuman persistence, the survivors of the 47th Penal Legion began to understand that even legends could bleed. Even angels could fall, and even the Emperor's chosen warriors could find redemption in the courage of those society had marked as failures. The moment of truth came not with trumpets or battle cries, but with the quiet click of an empty power pack and the sudden silence of Colonel Thorne's laser gun. Across the battlefield, similar sounds echoed as the 47th Penal Legion's ammunition finally ran dry, leaving 300 condemned souls with nothing but bayonets, desperation, and the terrible mathematics of close combat against enemies whose flesh had been modified for slaughter. "Fix bayonets!" Thorne commanded, his voice carrying the hollow authority of an officer ordering men to die with dignity. The distinctive snap of blade locks engaging created a metallic percussion across the defensive line, a sound that had preceded countless Imperial victories and infinitely more defeats. Brother Sergeant Cassius observed the penal troops' response with something approaching wonder. These branded criminals had been abandoned by Imperial command, equipped with failing weapons and sent to die on a world where the very ground hungered for their blood. Yet they formed battle lines with the precision of Cadian shock troops, their faces showing not panic, but the grim acceptance of soldiers who understood their duty. "You honor the throne," Cassius spoke over the tactical frequency, his damaged Vox system lending weight to words that carried the authority of 2 centuries fighting humanity's enemies. "Fight well, and the Emperor will remember your names when this world burns in holy fire." The promise was beautiful and almost certainly false. Penal legions were designed to be forgotten, their sacrifices unrecorded in official histories that celebrated only those deaths deemed worthy of remembrance. But in this moment, with heretics advancing and ammunition exhausted, beautiful lies served better than honest truths. Former tech adept Vane had saved his last power pack for this moment, his augmented senses calculating firing solutions, while his enhanced hands worked to repair the Space Marine's bolt pistol. The weapon's machine spirit had been damaged by warp corruption, its targeting arrays scrambled by contact with ammunition that existed partially outside real space. But the Omnissiah's knowledge flowed through blessed fingers, coaxing damaged systems back to temporary functionality. 15 rounds remaining, Vane reported while his mechadendrites performed emergency maintenance that would have taken ordinary tech marines hours to complete. Blessed bolts, sanctified for use against demonic entities. Each shot must count. The heretics came in a wave of corrupted flesh and living metal, their weapons replaced by organic appendages that fired projectiles made from crystallized screams. Some had traded legs for propulsion systems that allowed them to skitter across the transformed terrain like massive insects. Others had replaced their arms with bladed weapons that wept substances designed to inflict spiritual as well as physical damage. Trooper Mordian met the first heretic's charge with a bayonet thrust that found the gap between modified ribs, her scarred hands steady despite the madness surrounding her. The corrupted human's death scream carried harmonics that hurt to hear, but her blade found its mark with the precision of a soldier who had learned to kill efficiently rather than emotionally. "First blood to the 47th!" she shouted, though her voice was lost in the symphony of violence that erupted as 300 condemned souls proved that courage could exist even in those society had marked as failures. Former Sergeant Chenkov fought with the methodical efficiency that had made him valuable before his court-martial, his bayonet work creating a small circle of death around his position. The heretics pressed their assault with inhuman persistence, but each one that fell created obstacles for those behind, and veteran infantry knew how to use enemy corpses as improvised fortifications. "Hold the line!" Chenkov bellowed over the melee's din. "Make them pay for every meter in blood and suffering." The words carried across the battle line, transforming individual fights into coordinated resistance. These branded criminals had been trained as Imperial soldiers before their fall from grace, and muscle memory proved stronger than despair when survival depended on tactical discipline. Commissar Vex found himself fighting beside men whose brands he would normally have regarded as proof of irredeemable corruption. Deserters and thieves, cowards and heretics, but in this moment, they fought with courage that professional guard regiments might envy. His chainsword carved through modified flesh, while his bolt pistol delivered the Emperor's judgment to souls that had forfeited their humanity. "The Emperor protects the faithful," Vex roared, though the words carried new meaning when spoken in defense of those whom Imperial doctrine had condemned. "Stand fast in his service." Former Psyker Voss felt the warp pressure building as more corrupted souls entered close combat, their presence creating psychic turbulence that made reality itself unreliable. But instead of suppressing her abilities, she allowed them limited manifestation. Not the wild pyrokinetics that had marked her original fall, but careful telepathic coordination that allowed the 47th's scattered squads to fight as a unified force. "Behind you!" she projected directly into Corporal Hayes's mind, allowing him to turn and parry a blade strike that would have opened his spine. The effort left her bleeding from both nostrils, but the deserter's survival justified the risk of exposure. Brother Sergeant Cassius moved through the melee like a force of nature constrained by damaged flesh, his bolt pistol speaking with measured precision, while his remaining arm wielded a combat knife that had been blessed in the forges of Macraga. Each shot eliminated a heretic whose modifications made them too dangerous for mortal soldiers to engage, while his blade work created corridors of safety that allowed the penal troops to coordinate their defense. But even an Astartes had limits, and the warp corruption in his wounds was spreading with each moment of combat. His enhanced physiology fought against the spiritual poison, but the battle was being lost at the cellular level. Soon, even his superhuman endurance would fail, leaving the 47th alone against enemies whose numbers seemed endless. Former Medicae Thane had abandoned his lasgun in favor of a surgical kit, moving through the melee to provide battlefield aid to wounded who might otherwise bleed out in the mud. His medical training had never covered treating soldiers whose brands marked them as criminals, but blood was blood regardless of the sins that had spilled it. "Stay with me, trooper," he whispered to a wounded woman whose theft conviction had landed her in the Penal Legions. The Emperor's light burns in all faithful souls, regardless of past mistakes. The words were heretical by strict doctrinal interpretation. Redemption was supposed to come through death, not survival. But watching condemned souls fight with heroic determination while an injured space marine bled beside them, Thorn found himself wondering whether the Imperium's definitions of failure and success might need revision. As the melee reached its crescendo, with bayonets and blades creating a harvest of flesh under Gehenna Prime's corrupted sky, each survivor began to understand that they were participating in something larger than simple tactical engagement. This was the moment when the condemned would discover whether mercy was possible in a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of the word, or whether even angels could bleed out in trenches that history would never remember. The choice between duty and compassion was about to be written in blood and steel. The moment that shattered everything came when Trooper Cass Mordian found herself face to face with a heretic who still wore the tattered remains of an Astra Militarum uniform beneath layers of corrupted flesh. The enemy's laser gun had been fused with organic components that pulsed with unnatural life, but his eyes, Emperor, preserved them all. His eyes still held fragments of human recognition behind the chaos-spawned madness. "Please," the thing that had been a guardsman whispered, his voice a harmony of pain and desperate hunger. I remember the Emperor's light. Help me remember." Mordian's bayonet was already moving, trained reflexes overriding the horror of recognition. But in the split second before steel found flesh, she saw something that would haunt whatever remained of her life. Tears streaming down the heretic's corrupted face, human emotion surviving in a shell that served alien gods. Her blade pierced his heart with surgical precision, but his final words carried the weight of damnation. "Thank you, sister. Thank you for ending this." The revelation hit the 47th Penal Legion like a psychic shockwave. These weren't voluntary heretics who had chosen corruption. They were Imperial soldiers who had been transformed against their will, their flesh reshaped while their souls remained trapped in bodies that served the enemy. Every enemy they killed had been a comrade, a brother or sister in service to the Golden Throne, now wearing the face of chaos through no choice of their own. "Emperor's mercy," former Medicae Thane whispered as he recognized the surgical scars on another fallen heretic's chest. Modification patterns he'd seen in Imperial field hospitals, marks left by battlefield medicine that saved lives. This had been a wounded guardsman, captured and converted, rather than allowed the honor of dying in service. They're all prisoners, all of them. Colonel Thorn felt something fundamental break inside his chest as the tactical implications became clear. Every successful operation against Chaos forces on Gehenna Prime would require killing Imperial soldiers who had been transformed into weapons against their will. Victory would be measured not in enemies defeated, but in mercy killings performed for comrades who deserved better deaths than slow corruption into service for the ruinous powers. Brother Sergeant Cassius had seen such horrors before in his 2 centuries of service, but the sight of corrupted Imperial forces still struck him like a physical blow. His bolt pistol claimed another transformed guardsman, the explosive round ending suffering that might have lasted decades if left to continue. But each shot felt like executing loyal soldiers rather than eliminating enemies, and even Astartes' conditioning couldn't entirely numb that particular agony. "They chose this," Commissar Vex stated with the absolute certainty that sustained Imperial faith, though his voice carried undertones that suggested his own doubts. No true servant of the Emperor would allow themselves to be corrupted, regardless of circumstances. These creatures have forfeited their humanity through weakness. But even as he spoke the words, Vex found himself remembering the faces. human expressions visible beneath chaos modifications, recognition in eyes that should have held only madness, tears shed by things that retained enough humanity to mourn their own transformation. His bolt pistol continued firing, each shot a small act of mercy disguised as military necessity. Former Psyker Voss felt the psychic echoes of the transformed soldier's final moments, desperate prayers to the Emperor continuing even as their flesh betrayed them, loyalty surviving in souls whose bodies served alien masters. The telepathic residue of their suffering created a warp resonance that made her abilities surge beyond safe limits, blood flowing freely from her nose and ears as she struggled to maintain mental barriers. "They never stopped believing," she gasped, her words carrying the authority of direct psychic contact with the dying. "Even transformed, they kept faith. They're begging us to end their suffering, to free them from bodies that won't obey their will." The revelation transformed the battle from tactical engagement into something approaching religious duty. The 47th wasn't fighting enemies. They were performing last rites for comrades who had been denied the honor of dying cleanly in Imperial service. Each bayonet thrust became an act of compassion, each death a small victory for human dignity against the forces that sought to corrupt everything the Imperium represented. Tech Adept Vane processed the situation with mechanical precision, while his augmented hands worked to maintain Brother Sergeant Cassius's failing equipment. The tactical mathematics were straightforward. Imperial forces converted against their will retained enough human psychology to be predictable in combat, but their numbers suggested systematic capture and transformation operations that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Estimated conversion time based on observed modification patterns, Vane reported while his mechadendrites performed field maintenance on damaged bolt pistol components. 6 to 8 weeks from capture to full battlefield deployment. The enemy has been harvesting Imperial forces for systematic transformation into anti-Imperial assets. The words carried implications that reached beyond immediate tactical concerns. If Chaos forces were converting captured Imperial soldiers rather than simply killing them, then every military operation became a potential recruitment drive for the enemy. Victory would require not just defeating hostile forces, but ensuring that no Imperial personnel fell into enemy hands alive. Sergeant Chenkov fought with renewed determination, his bayonet work taking on almost surgical precision as he sought to end suffering rather than simply eliminate threats. The heretic he faced had been a sergeant once. The rank insignia was still visible beneath layers of corrupted flesh, and fought with tactical awareness that spoke of decades serving the Emperor's cause. "I'm sorry, brother," Chenkov whispered as his blade found the gap between modified ribs. "You deserved a better death than this." The transformed sergeant's final expression showed gratitude rather than pain, human recognition breaking through chaos conditioning in the last moments before death claimed what remained of his soul. It was the look of a soldier finally receiving the mercy he'd been denied through months of unwilling service to powers that despised everything he'd once represented. As the melee continued with the 47th providing mercy rather than simply inflicting death, Colonel Thorne found himself facing an impossible choice. Military doctrine demanded advancing toward the primary objective regardless of casualties or psychological impact. But human compassion suggested that some victories cost more than defeat, that some successes left wounds that never healed in souls that witnessed them. The protocol that had guided his entire career, complete the mission, accept casualties, serve the greater good, suddenly felt inadequate when applied to situations where the enemy wore familiar faces and begged for death, with voices that retained fragments of Imperial loyalty. Standing ankle-deep in blood that had been spilled by both sides but belonged to soldiers who had all once served the same master, Marcus Thorne prepared to make the decision that would define whether mercy could survive in a galaxy where even angels bled out in trenches that history would forget. The mathematics of acceptable loss were about to be recalculated using variables that included the weight of human souls. The breaking point arrived not with fanfare, but with silence. The terrible quiet that descended when Commissar Octavius Vex's bolt pistol clicked empty and his hand froze above the holster. For 30 seconds that stretched like hours. The man who had built his entire identity around absolute certainty stood paralyzed, watching condemned criminals perform acts of mercy that his doctrine labeled as heretical weakness. Trooper Mills, his conduct unbecoming brand still visible beneath the blood and grime, cradled the head of a dying heretic who had been a Navy armsman before chaos claimed him. The transformed sailor wept as he recognized Imperial uniform patterns, his corrupted vocal cords struggling to form words that had once been the Imperial creed. Mills didn't pull away from the blasphemous contact. Instead, he recited the litany of final rest, offering spiritual comfort to a soul that theology insisted was beyond salvation. "The Emperor protects the faithful," Mills whispered, completing the ritual words over the armsman's final breath. "In death, service ends. In service's end, peace eternal." Vex watched this interaction with growing horror that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with doctrinal collapse. His training, his faith, his absolute certainty about the nature of heresy and redemption, all of it crumbling as he observed branded criminals showing more spiritual grace than many ordained priests he'd known. "Commissar," former Medicae Thane approached with careful respect, his hands stained with blood from treating both Imperial and formerly Imperial wounded without distinction. "Your bolt pistol. I have medical supplies that could serve as improvised ammunition. Mercy rounds to end suffering more cleanly than bayonet work." The offer should have been welcomed, practical assistance in maintaining battlefield discipline and ensuring swift justice for the corrupted. But Vex found himself staring at the weapon in his hands, as if seeing it for the first time. When had his sacred duty transformed into simple murder? When had delivering the Emperor's judgment become indistinguishable from executing loyal soldiers who had been denied the honor of dying cleanly? Vex began, then stopped, the words dying in his throat. For 30 years, absolute faith had provided answers to every moral question. But standing in the ruins of Gehenna Prime, surrounded by condemned souls showing greater compassion than Imperial doctrine allowed, that faith felt inadequate to address the complexity of reality. Brother Sergeant Cassius observed the Commissar's crisis with the clinical assessment of an Astartes who had witnessed the collapse of certainty in countless mortal minds. His own faith remained unshaken. The Emperor's will was absolute, regardless of temporary confusion about its interpretation. But even Space Marines understood that mortal psychology operated by different rules, and Vex's breakdown threatened unit cohesion at a critical moment. "Faith tested is faith strengthened," Cassius spoke over the tactical channel, his damaged Vox system lending weight to words drawn from 2 centuries of experience. "The Emperor's light burns brightest in darkness, Commissar. Your duty remains unchanged, regardless of circumstances that challenge understanding." But the words rang hollow even as he spoke them. Cassius had been trained to accept moral complexity as part of serving in the Long War. But these penal troops were discovering compassion in situations where Imperial doctrine demanded only ruthless efficiency. Their branded sins had prepared them for moral ambiguity in ways that pristine faith could not. Former Psyker Voss felt the psychic resonance of Vex's spiritual collapse, the way absolute certainty transformed into paralyzing doubt when reality proved more complex than doctrine suggested. Her telepathic senses detected the Commissar's genuine anguish, This wasn't weakness or cowardice, but the honest confusion of a faithful soul discovering that good and evil weren't always clearly distinguished. "The Emperor judges hearts, not actions," she said quietly, moving to stand beside the frozen Commissar. "These transformed soldiers retained faith even as their flesh served alien masters. Perhaps our brands mark us as failures in the eyes of men, but the Emperor sees deeper than human judgment." The words were heretical by strict interpretation, suggesting that imperial tribunals might err in their judgments, that condemned souls might retain spiritual value despite official condemnation. But they carried the weight of direct psychic contact with the dying, telepathic evidence that loyalty could survive even chaos corruption. Colonel Thorne watched his Commissar's breakdown with growing alarm, understanding that unit cohesion depended on maintaining some semblance of command authority. But he also recognized the spiritual courage required to question absolute certainty when faced with evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about faith and duty. "Commissar Vex," Thorne spoke with the careful respect due to political officers, even those experiencing doctrinal crisis. "Your guidance has brought us this far. The men need your leadership regardless of theological complexities we've encountered." It was a gentle way of saying that philosophy could wait until after immediate survival had been secured, but Vex understood the deeper implications. His role as spiritual authority for the regiment required maintaining faith even when that faith felt inadequate to address the moral complexity of their situation. Tech Adept Vane had been observing the Commissar's psychological state with the clinical detachment that augmented minds brought to emotional analysis. Vex's breakdown followed predictable patterns: absolute certainty challenged by evidence that couldn't be dismissed, cognitive dissonance creating paralysis until new equilibrium could be established. "Doubt is not heresy," Vane stated with mechanical precision while his hands continued maintaining damaged equipment. "The Omnissiah teaches that certainty without testing leads to stagnation. Faith that cannot adapt to new data becomes dogma, and dogma serves the machine god poorly." The observation carried weight precisely because it came from someone whose entire existence depended on balancing faith with empirical evidence. If a tech adept could acknowledge the value of tested belief, perhaps a Commissar could find room for compassion within the framework of absolute duty. Sergeant Chenkov approached the group with the pragmatic directness that had made him valuable before his court-martial for tactical flexibility. His massive frame bore fresh wounds from the melee, but his expression carried the calm certainty of a veteran who understood that survival required adapting to circumstances rather than forcing circumstances to match expectations. "Sir," he addressed Vex with careful formality, "the men are looking to you for guidance. Whether we call it mercy or military necessity, they need to know that ending the suffering of corrupted comrades serves the Emperor's will." The words offered Vex a theological framework that preserved doctrinal integrity while allowing compassionate action. Mercy killings could be classified as military necessity rather than emotional weakness, maintaining the distinction between duty and sentiment that imperial faith required. As the sounds of battle began to fade around their defensive positions, Commissar Vex faced the choice that would define not just his own faith, but the spiritual direction of an entire regiment. The bolt pistol in his hands could deliver judgment or mercy, condemnation or compassion. But in this moment, the difference between those options had become impossible to distinguish. The Emperor's light was about to shine through the cracks in absolute certainty, revealing truths that doctrine had never been designed to address. The first shells began falling at 13:47 hours local time, announced by the distinctive whistle that had preceded 10,000 Imperial victories and infinitely more defeats. But these weren't precision strikes against enemy positions. The barrage was falling directly on the 47th Penal Legion's defensive lines, each explosion perfectly calculated to eliminate the very soldiers who had just proven their loyalty in blood and courage. "Incoming fire!" Sergeant Chenkov roared, though his voice carried the hollow tone of a man stating the obvious while watching the impossible unfold. "Take cover! Friendly artillery! Danger close!" The bitter irony wasn't lost on any survivor. After fighting transformed Imperial soldiers with bayonets and compassion, after discovering mercy in the hearts of the condemned, after witnessing a space marine bleed alongside criminals branded as failures, now their own command was delivering the final judgment from the safety of orbital platforms. Colonel Thorne pressed his combead, desperately trying to establish contact with regimental command, as explosions walked across their positions with mechanical precision. "This is Thorne, 47th Penal, requesting immediate ceasefire. We are Imperial forces. Repeat, Imperial forces in defensive positions." The response came through crackling static, delivered in the emotionless tone of a staff officer reading from prepared scripts. "Colonel Thorne, your unit has been reclassified as acceptable losses. Primary objective achieved. Chaos force strength assessed. Defensive positions mapped. Enemy capabilities documented. Orbital bombardment will sanitize the operational area in 15 minutes. Emperor protects." The Vox channel went dead, leaving 300 souls to confront the mathematics of expendable units and acceptable casualties. They had served their purpose. Human reconnaissance probes fired at a problem too dangerous for regular Imperial forces. Their survival had never been part of the tactical equation. Tech adept Vane processed the situation with mechanical precision, while his augmented senses detected the approach of heavier bombardment. The orbital batteries were shifting from ranging shots to full-scale area denial, preparing to turn several square kilometers of Gehenna Prime into a glass crater that would eliminate both Imperial and Chaos forces without distinction. Pattern analysis suggests systematic elimination rather than tactical support, Vane reported over the squad channel, his augmented voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone describing equipment failure. "We have approximately 12 minutes before the orbital strike reaches full intensity. Survival probability in current positions, 0.03%. Brother Sergeant Cassius had seen this scenario before. Loyal Imperial forces written off as acceptable losses when their survival became inconvenient to higher command priorities. His enhanced senses detected the approach of more sophisticated ordnance, shells designed to ensure that nothing survived the sanitization process. "Move!" he commanded, his damaged power armor servos whining as he struggled to stand. "The bombardment pattern suggests command intends total area sterilization. We need to evacuate before the heavy ordnance arrives." But even as he spoke, Cassius understood the tactical impossibility. The 47th had no transport, no communication with evacuation assets, and insufficient time to reach minimum safe distance from orbital bombardment designed to eliminate chaos corruption at the molecular level. They were trapped in a killing zone created by their own command structure. Former Psyker Voss felt the psychic echoes of betrayal rippling through the regiment as each soldier understood their situation. These branded souls had fought with heroic determination, had shown mercy to corrupted comrades, had proven their loyalty through actions rather than words, only to discover that Imperial command viewed them as expendable assets whose disposal was more convenient than extraction. "They never intended for us to survive," she whispered, her telepathic senses detecting the cold calculation behind the bombardment. "We were ammunition, fired at the enemy to reveal their positions. Now that the information has been gathered..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the mathematics of Penal Legion deployment. Success was measured in intelligence gathered rather than lives preserved. and dead criminals told no inconvenient stories about moral complexity in Imperial operations. Commissar Vex found ironic clarity in betrayal, his doctrinal crisis resolving as he faced the choice between blind obedience and conscious compassion. The bombardment represented Imperial doctrine in its purest form, ruthless efficiency divorced from human consideration, victory achieved through acceptable sacrifice of those deemed expendable. The Emperor protects the faithful, he spoke over the regimental frequency, his voice carrying new authority born from tested rather than assumed faith. But faith requires more than obedience to orders that serve politics rather than righteousness. We stand together, or we die separately as criminals. I choose to stand. The words were heretical by strict interpretation, a commissar placing human loyalty above imperial command structure. But they carried the weight of authentic conviction, faith tested by fire rather than sustained by comfortable certainty. Trooper Mordian felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of duty and honor as she watched orbital strikes eliminate wounded who couldn't be moved in time. The branded criminals of the 47th had proven their worth through actions, but Imperial Command preferred dead heroes to living complications. Orders, she asked Colonel Thorne, though her scarred hands were already checking her equipment for what might be their final action as Imperial soldiers. Thorne studied the tactical situation with the professional assessment of a career officer who had just discovered the limits of institutional loyalty. They could die as acceptable losses, following orders that served convenience rather than justice. Or they could choose their own deaths, fighting for principles that transcended command structure and political expediency. "New objective," he announced over the regimental frequency, his voice carrying the authority of a leader rather than simply an officer. "We hold this position not because command orders it, but because it's right. We protect each other not because regulations require it, but because that's what soldiers do for soldiers." The bombardment intensified as orbital platforms began their systematic sterilization of the operational area. But among the ruins of what had been defensive positions, 300 condemned souls prepared to make their stand not as expendable assets in someone else's war, but as Imperial soldiers who had rediscovered what service truly meant. They would die as they had fought, together with honor, proving that mercy could survive even when betrayed by those who claimed to serve the same master. The Emperor's light would shine through their sacrifice, even if history would never record their names or acknowledge their courage. The mathematics of acceptable loss were about to be recalculated by souls who refused to be reduced to statistical abstractions. In the moments between betrayal and annihilation, something unprecedented occurred among the branded souls of the 47th Penal Legion. They chose each other over the institution that had condemned them, not through mutiny or rebellion, but through the simple recognition that brotherhood forged in battle transcended the bureaucratic mathematics that reduced human lives to acceptable losses. Former Sergeant Viktor Chenkov moved through the bombardment with the methodical precision of a career soldier, but his actions served loyalty rather than doctrine. He dragged wounded comrades to whatever shelter the twisted landscape provided, his massive frame shielding smaller soldiers from shrapnel that screamed through the air like metallic rain. "Stay low, stay together," he commanded, though his words carried the authority of chosen leadership rather than imposed rank. "We've survived this long by covering each other. That doesn't change just because command has written us off." Beside him, Trooper Mills, the man whose conduct unbecoming had landed him in penal service for questioning orders that served politics rather than tactics, worked to establish communications with scattered squads. His crime had been caring more about his soldiers than his career, and that same impulse now drove him to maintain unit cohesion when institutional support had evaporated. "All units, check in," Mills spoke over the squad channel, his voice steady despite the shells falling around their positions. "We're not acceptable losses. We're the 47th Penal Legion, and we stand together until the end." The responses came from positions across the killing zone, each voice representing a branded soul who had discovered that redemption came through choosing loyalty over survival, compassion over convenience. Former thieves and deserters, branded heretics and court-martialed officers, all united in the recognition that they were worth more than the mathematics of expendable deployment. Tech adept Vane had established himself in the ruins of what might have been a shrine, his augmented senses tracking the orbital bombardment's pattern while his hands worked to maintain communications equipment that allowed the scattered regiment to coordinate their final action. His unsanctioned experimentation had cost him his red robes, but the same innovative thinking now served to keep his adopted brothers alive, long enough to die with meaning. "Bombardment analysis complete," Vane reported over the tactical frequency. "The orbital platforms are following standard area denial protocols, but they're avoiding direct hits on the cathedral ruins. Command wants that structure intact for follow-up operations." The observations sparked tactical thinking among soldiers who had been reduced to expendable ammunition but retained the professional skills that had made them valuable before their various falls from grace. If command wanted the cathedral preserved, then that structure represented more than simple religious significance. It contained intelligence assets that justified the expenditure of an entire penal regiment. Brother Sergeant Cassius processed the information with the strategic awareness that 2 centuries of warfare had burned into his enhanced mind. His damaged power armor still functioned partially, but the warp corruption in his wounds was spreading beyond any possibility of medical intervention. He would die on Gehenna Prime, but that death could serve purposes beyond simple sacrifice if properly directed. "The cathedral is the primary objective," Cassius spoke over the command frequency, his damaged Vox system lending weight to words that carried the authority of the Adeptus Astartes. "Whatever intelligence command seeks lies within those walls. If we can secure it before the final bombardment." He didn't need to complete the thought. Everyone understood the mathematics of their situation. They were already dead, written off in reports that had been filed before the first shell fell. But dying with purpose was different from dying as statistics, and purpose could be found in denying their betrayers the easy victory that expendable deployment was supposed to provide. Former Psycho Voss felt the psychic resonance building around the cathedral as the regiment's scattered elements began moving toward the twisted spires. Her abilities, suppressed for years through fear of execution, now served to coordinate movement through terrain where orbital bombardment had made conventional communication impossible. "There's something in there," she reported, her telepathic senses detecting the presence that had drawn chaos forces to this world. "Not demon, not human. Something older. The corruption here isn't random. It's been guided by intelligence that predates Imperial contact." The revelation added urgency to their movement. If Gehenna Prime harbored xenotech or archaeotech significant enough to justify expendable deployment of an entire regiment, then the 47th sacrifice was serving purposes that reached beyond immediate tactical concerns. They had become unwitting participants in conflicts that spanned millennia. Commissar Vex moved among the advancing soldiers with renewed purpose, his doctrinal crisis resolved through the recognition that faith required action rather than simple obedience. His bolt pistol had been reloaded with ammunition, improvised from medical supplies, mercy rounds designed to end suffering rather than inflict judgment. "The Emperor protects the faithful," he spoke to each group as they advanced, his words carrying new meaning forged through tested conviction. Not through institutional authority, but through the choices we make when authority fails. We are still Imperial soldiers. We prove that through our actions, not our brands. Colonel Thorne led the advance with the tactical awareness of a professional officer who had discovered that leadership meant more than following orders from people who would never share the consequences of their decisions. The 47th had been betrayed by command, but they could still serve the Emperor through their own choice rather than imposed duty. "Remember why we're here," Thorne addressed the regiment over their functioning communications. "Not because we're criminals seeking redemption, but because we're soldiers who still believe in something worth dying for. Let command write us off as acceptable losses. We'll show them what unacceptable courage looks like." As the branded souls of the 47th Penal Legion advanced through orbital bombardment toward objectives that command had intended for regular forces to secure after their expendable deployment, each condemned soul understood that they were participating in something larger than simple military action. They were choosing to be remembered as soldiers rather than statistics, brothers rather than acceptable losses, human beings rather than expendable ammunition fired at problems too dangerous for those whose lives mattered to imperial bureaucracy. The mathematics of betrayal were about to encounter the incalculable variable of souls who refused to be reduced to numbers in someone else's equation of acceptable sacrifice. Golgotha Ridge rose from the twisted landscape of Gehenna Prime like the spine of some buried leviathan, its jagged peaks crowned with the cathedral that had drawn chaos forces and imperial blood in equal measure. The 47th Penal Legion survivors, perhaps 80 souls from the original 300, occupied positions along the ridge's lower slopes, their orange fatigues now indistinguishable from the crimson soil beneath layers of blood, grime, and the ash of their own dead. Colonel Thorne established his command post in what had been a mining station before chaos corruption had transformed industrial equipment into organic processing centers that pulsed with malevolent life. His tactical display showed the bitter mathematics of their situation. 80 condemned souls with minimal ammunition, facing orbital bombardment from above and chaos forces advancing from below, all while protecting a cathedral that contained secrets worth more than their combined lives. "Final defensive positions," Thorne ordered, over the failing communications network, his voice carrying the authority of a leader rather than simply an officer. "No retreat, no surrender, no acceptable losses. We hold this ridge because it needs holding, and we're the ones who chose to hold it." Brother Sergeant Cassius had claimed the highest defensible position on the ridge, his damaged power armor and failing bolt pistol still representing more firepower than the rest of the regiment combined. The warp corruption in his wounds had spread beyond containment, but superhuman physiology was buying time that mortal soldiers couldn't afford. Each shot from his blessed weapon eliminated enemies that would have required squads of regular troops to defeat. "Contact approaching from all vectors," Cassius reported over the tactical frequency, his enhanced senses detecting movement patterns that suggested coordinated assault. Enemy strength estimated at brigade level, with heavy support weapons and modified vehicles. They want this position badly enough to expend significant resources. The observation carried implications that reached beyond immediate tactical concerns. If Chaos forces were committing major assets to secure the cathedral, then whatever lay within those twisted spires was worth more than the 47th had realized. Their final stand was protecting something that might influence the broader war for Gehenna Prime. Former tech adept Vane had established a workshop in the ruins of a communications array, his augmented hands working to maintain weapons and equipment through techniques that bordered on miraculous. His unsanctioned experimentation had cost him his red robes, but the same innovative thinking now served to keep laser guns firing and Vox units functioning when conventional maintenance would have failed hours ago. "Ammunition status critical across all units," Vane reported while his mechadendrites performed emergency repairs on damaged power packs. I can maintain approximately 30 weapons at marginal effectiveness for perhaps 20 minutes. After that, we're reduced to bayonet work and harsh language. Trooper Mordian had taken position behind a barricade constructed from the bodies of Chaos cultists and transformed Imperial soldiers, her scarred hands steady on a lasgun that had been repaired so many times that its machine spirit might have developed personality through pure stubbornness. Her violence against Superior Officer Brand seemed almost quaint compared to the violence she was about to inflict on enemies who threatened her chosen brothers. "Movement in Sector 7, she reported, her experienced eye tracking figures that moved with the fluid grace of beings whose flesh had been optimized for warfare. "Looks like the enemy's bringing their special units for the final push." The Chaos forces advancing up Golgotha Ridge represented the full spectrum of corruption that could be achieved when human flesh became raw material for alien artistry. Some retained recognizably human forms, though their weapons and equipment had been fused with organic components that pulsed with unnatural life. Others had been transformed into living weapons platforms, their spines replaced with mounting systems for heavy weapons, while their nervous systems were rewired to serve as targeting computers. Former Psyker Voss felt the psychic pressure building as the enemy approached, their combined presence creating warp disturbances that made reality itself unreliable. Her abilities, no longer suppressed through fear of execution, now served to coordinate the 47th's defense through telepathic links that allowed perfect tactical communication despite damaged equipment. "They're not just attacking," she reported, her mental senses detecting the complex patterns of enemy movement. "They're performing some kind of ritual. The assault itself is part of a larger ceremony designed to activate whatever's in the cathedral." The revelation added urgency to their defense that transcended simple survival. If the 47th's final stand was disrupting a chaos ritual significant enough to corrupt an entire world, then their deaths might serve purposes that reached far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Commissar Vex moved among the defensive positions with renewed faith that had been tested by betrayal and purified by conscious choice. His bolt pistol carried mercy rounds that would end the suffering of transformed Imperial soldiers, while his voice carried spiritual authority earned through genuine conviction rather than institutional appointment. "The Emperor protects the faithful," he declared over the regimental frequency, his words carrying new meaning forged through tested belief. Not through bureaucratic authority, but through the choices we make when authority fails us. "Stand fast, brothers. We are still Imperial soldiers, regardless of what our brands claim." Sergeant Chenkov had established the primary firing line along the ridge's crest, his massive frame serving as an anchor point for defensive positions that stretched across several hundred meters of broken ground. His tactical experience, earned through 20 years of service before his court-martial for flexibility over doctrine, now coordinated the defense of soldiers who had chosen loyalty over survival. "Here they come," Chenkov announced over the squad channels, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a veteran who had seen enough battles to understand that courage was a choice rather than an absence of fear. "Remember, we're not dying as criminals seeking redemption. We're living as soldiers who chose to stand when standing was right." The first wave of the final assault crested the ridge's lower slopes like a tide of corrupted flesh and twisted metal, their weapons discharging volleys of ammunition that screamed with the voices of the damned. But they faced not condemned souls seeking absolution through death, but Imperial soldiers who had discovered that brotherhood transcended institutional betrayal and that honor could survive even when abandoned by those who claimed to represent it. As the 47th Penal Legion prepared to make their final stand on Golgotha Ridge, each surviving soul understood that they were participating in something larger than military engagement. They were proving that mercy, loyalty, and human dignity could survive even in a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of those words. The mathematics of acceptable loss were about to encounter the incalculable courage of souls who refused to be reduced to statistical abstractions in someone else's equation of expedient sacrifice. The moment when mercy died came not with grand proclamations or theological debates, but with the simple arithmetic of ammunition running dry and enemies still climbing toward positions held by souls who had chosen loyalty over survival. The 47th Penal Legion's final stand on Golgotha Ridge would be decided by bayonets, determination, and the terrible mathematics of how much human courage could accomplish when institutional support had been withdrawn. "Last power pack," former tech adept Vane announced over the failing communications network, his augmented hands working to distribute the remaining energy cells among weapons that had been maintained through mechanical miracles and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. "Estimate 12 minutes of sustained fire before we're reduced to close combat." The words carried implications that every veteran understood. 12 minutes to inflict maximum casualties on an enemy force that outnumbered them 10-1, followed by hand-to-hand combat against beings whose flesh had been optimized for slaughter. The mathematics were simple and utterly hopeless. But Colonel Thorne had moved beyond mathematical considerations into territory where leadership transcended tactical analysis. Standing among soldiers whose brands marked them as failures, he had discovered that courage could exist independently of institutional validation and that honor could survive betrayal by those who claimed authority over it. "Fix bayonets," Thorne commanded, his voice carrying across the ridge with the authority of conscious choice rather than imposed rank. "We've proven we're soldiers. Now we prove we're brothers." The distinctive snap of blade locks engaging created a metallic percussion that had preceded countless Imperial victories and infinitely more defeats, but this time the sound carried different meaning. These weren't condemned souls seeking redemption through death. These were Imperial soldiers who had chosen their own definition of duty when official duty had proven inadequate to address moral complexity. Brother Sergeant Cassius had taken position at the ridge's highest point, his damaged power armor and failing bolt pistol still representing more combat effectiveness than the remainder of the regiment combined. The warp corruption in his wounds had spread beyond any possibility of medical intervention, but Astarte's physiology was buying time that mortal soldiers couldn't afford. "For the Emperor and the Primarch," Cassius spoke over the tactical frequency, his damaged Vox system lending weight to words that carried 2 centuries of service. "And for soldiers who proved that brands mark bodies, not souls." The approaching chaos forces represented the full spectrum of corruption that human flesh could sustain while retaining battlefield effectiveness. Some moved with the fluid grace of beings whose joints had been replaced with mechanisms that permitted impossible flexibility. Others had traded limbs for weapon systems that fired ammunition made from crystallized emotions. But all of them bore expressions of religious ecstasy as they climbed toward positions defended by souls who had rediscovered faith through conscious choice rather than institutional indoctrination. Former Psyker Voss felt the psychic pressure building as hundreds of corrupted minds focused their attention on the ridge's defenders, their combined presence creating warp disturbances that made reality itself negotiable. Her abilities, no longer suppressed through fear of execution, now served to coordinate the 47th's final actions through telepathic links that transcended damaged communications equipment. "The ritual," she gasped, her mental senses detecting the complex patterns underlying the chaos assault. "Our deaths aren't just tactical objectives. They're components in a ceremony designed to activate whatever's sleeping in the cathedral. Every soul we lose feeds power into their working." The revelation transformed their final stand from simple military action into spiritual warfare, where the manner of death mattered as much as tactical effectiveness. If chaos forces required their deaths to complete whatever ritual they were performing, then choosing how to die became an act of defiance that reached beyond immediate battlefield concerns. Commissar Vex moved among the defensive positions with faith that had been purified by betrayal and conscious choice. His bolt pistol loaded with mercy rounds, while his voice carried spiritual authority earned through genuine conviction rather than institutional appointment. He had discovered that the Emperor's light burned brightest when chosen freely rather than imposed through doctrine. "We deny them our despair," Vex declared over the regimental frequency, his words carrying new meaning forged through tested belief. "They want our deaths to feed their ritual. We give them our lives in service of something greater. Stand fast, brothers. We die as Imperial soldiers who chose loyalty over survival." The first clash came as Chaos forces reached the outer defensive positions, their corrupted weapons meeting Imperial steel in combat that violated every principle of civilized warfare. But the 47th responded with discipline that professional Guard regiments would struggle to match, their branded souls proving that skill and determination could exist independently of institutional validation. Trooper Mordian met the first heretics charge with a bayonet thrust that found the gap between modified ribs, her scarred hands steady despite facing an enemy whose flesh had been optimized for close combat. The Chaos Warrior's death scream carried harmonics that hurt to hear, but her blade work created space for other defenders to coordinate their response. "First blood to the 47th!" she shouted, though her voice carried grim satisfaction rather than triumph. This wasn't victory. It was proof that condemned souls could die with meaning when given the choice to define that meaning themselves. Sergeant Chenkov fought with methodical efficiency that turned his defensive position into a killing ground where enemies died in precisely calculated sequence. His tactical experience, earned through 20 years of service before his court-martial for choosing soldiers over politics, now coordinated defensive actions that maximized enemy casualties while preserving friendly lives for as long as mathematically possible. "Hold the line!" Chenkov bellowed over the melee's din, his voice carrying across positions where branded criminals fought with heroic determination. "Make them pay for every meter in blood and suffering." As the Chaos forces pressed their assault with inhuman persistence, while the 47th met them with steel and courage that transcended institutional betrayal, each surviving soul understood that they were participating in something larger than simple military engagement. They were proving that mercy could die when abandoned by those who claimed authority over it, but that brotherhood, loyalty, and human dignity could survive even when official support had been withdrawn. Their final stand on Golgotha Ridge would demonstrate what Imperial soldiers could accomplish when fighting for principles they had chosen rather than orders they had been given. The mathematics of acceptable loss were about to encounter the incalculable courage of souls who refused to be reduced to components in someone else's ritual of expedient sacrifice. The end came with dawn bleeding red light across the corpse-strewn slopes of Golgotha Ridge, illuminating a field of battle where the mathematics of acceptable loss had been redefined by souls who refused to be counted as expendable. Of the original 300 condemned souls of the 47th Penal Legion, 17 remained standing among defensive positions built from the bodies of enemies and brothers alike. Colonel Marcus Thorne sat propped against the twisted remains of a Chaos weapon platform, his chainsword silent at last, its blessed teeth clogged with the flesh of beings who had once been Imperial soldiers. A lass burn had taken his left eye, and blood seeped through makeshift bandages that former Medicae Thane had applied before falling to corrupted blades. But his remaining eye held satisfaction rather than despair as he surveyed what his condemned souls had accomplished. They had held, against odds that violated tactical probability, against enemies whose numbers should have overwhelmed them in minutes, against betrayal by the very command structure they had sworn to serve. The 47th Penal Legion had held Golgotha Ridge until no more enemies climbed toward their positions. The chaos ritual was broken, its components scattered across terrain painted crimson with the sacrifice of souls who had chosen meaning over survival. Brother Sergeant Cassius lay where he had fallen, his power armor cracked like an eggshell, but his bolt pistol still gripped in hands that would never release it. The warp corruption had finally claimed his superhuman physiology, but not before he had eliminated the Chaos Sorcerer, whose death scream had shattered windows in the cathedral below. His final words had been spoken over the tactical frequency. The Emperor protects the faithful, and faith is proven through choice, not birth. The Space Marine's death had broken something fundamental in Commissar Vex, who knelt beside the fallen Astartes with tears streaming down his face. His bolt pistol lay forgotten in the mud, its mercy rounds expended on transformed Imperial soldiers who had begged for release from bodies that served alien masters. His faith remained absolute, but it had been purified by fire until only its essential core remained. The Emperor's light burned brightest in those who chose to kindle it, regardless of the brands that marked their flesh. "We did it." Former tech adept Vane spoke through Vox systems that ran on power cells improvised from medical equipment and sheer mechanical stubbornness. His augmented body bore wounds that would have killed baseline humans hours ago, but his hands still moved with precise efficiency as he maintained communications that allowed the survivors to coordinate their final actions. The ritual is broken. Whatever was sleeping in the cathedral will remain sleeping. Trooper Cass Mordian had claimed the ridge's highest point, her lasgun long since reduced to a glorified club after its power cells had failed and its barrel had warped from sustained fire. Her scarred knuckles gripped a bayonet that had been broken and reforged so many times that it might have developed spiritual significance through pure necessity. Around her lay the bodies of Chaos warriors who had learned that branded criminals could fight with courage that professional soldiers would envy. "Any word from command?" she asked, though her voice carried the bitter humor of someone who already knew the answer. Imperial Command had written them off as acceptable losses before the first shell fell. Their survival was an administrative inconvenience that would be corrected in after-action reports claiming total unit casualties. Former Psyker Lydia Voss sat in the ruins of what had been the communications array, her abilities no longer suppressed by fear of execution. The psychic echoes of the battle would haunt this ridge for centuries, the telepathic resonance of condemned souls choosing loyalty over survival, brotherhood over institutional betrayal, meaning over simple mathematics. Her mind touched the lingering traces of 300 spirits who had died as Imperial soldiers rather than live as acceptable losses. "They're not coming for us," she reported, her psychic senses detecting the orbital bombardment platforms repositioning for final sterilization. Command considers the primary objective achieved. Estimated time until area denial bombardment, 37 minutes. The words carried implications that every survivor understood. They had perhaps half an hour before orbital strikes would turn Golgotha Ridge into a glass crater, eliminating both chaos corruption and inconvenient witnesses to the expendable deployment of an entire regiment. Their heroic stand would become a classified footnote in reports that celebrated tactical success while ignoring the human cost. Sergeant Viktor Chenkov moved among the wounded with the methodical care that had made him valuable before his court-martial for choosing soldiers over doctrine. His massive frame bore wounds that spoke of close combat against enemies whose flesh had been optimized for slaughter, but his hands remained gentle as he provided what comfort was possible for dying comrades. "Any regrets?" he asked Colonel Thorne while checking bandages that had been fashioned from uniform fabric and blessed with prayers that carried more faith than most official liturgies. Thorne considered the question while studying the faces of soldiers who had proven that brands marked bodies rather than souls, that redemption came through conscious choice rather than institutional validation. that courage could exist independently of official recognition. These condemned souls had discovered brotherhood in the mathematics of expendable deployment and had chosen loyalty when loyalty had been abandoned by those who claimed authority over it. "None," Thorn replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a leader who had discovered that command meant more than following orders from people who would never share the consequences of their decisions. "We proved what Imperial soldiers could accomplish when fighting for principles they chose rather than orders they were given. History won't remember our names, but the Emperor knows what we accomplished here." As the orbital bombardment platforms completed their targeting calculations, and the survivors of the 47th Penal Legion prepared for the final sterilization that would eliminate both chaos corruption and inconvenient witnesses to institutional betrayal, each condemned soul understood that they had participated in something larger than simple military engagement. They had proven that mercy could die when abandoned by those who claimed authority over it, but that brotherhood, loyalty, and human dignity could survive even when official support had been withdrawn. Their brands had marked them as failures in the eyes of men, but their actions on Golgotha Ridge had written a different judgment in blood and courage that would endure long after their names were forgotten. The mathematics of acceptable loss had encountered the incalculable courage of souls who refused to be reduced to statistical abstractions. And for once in the galaxy's dark history, humanity had won a victory that mattered more than tactical objectives or strategic advantages. It had won a victory for the simple principle that every soul had worth, regardless of the brands that marked their flesh or the institutions that had condemned them as expendable. Colonel Marcus Thorn spent his last 30 seconds thinking not of the institution that had betrayed him, but of the faces around him. Branded criminals who had discovered that courage was a choice rather than an absence of fear. That brotherhood could transcend official condemnation, that mercy could survive even when abandoned by those who claimed authority over it. They had proven that the Emperor's light burned brightest in those who chose to kindle it, regardless of the marks that scarred their flesh. Commissar Octavius Vex held the hand of a dying trooper whose brand read, "Theft of Imperial Property," a crime that had involved stealing medical supplies for plague victims in an underhive district. In his final moments, Vex understood that his 30 years of absolute certainty had been preparation for this single instant of tested faith, where doctrine gave way to human compassion and institutional authority yielded to conscious choice. The lance strike that claimed them all lasted exactly 0.7 seconds, transforming organic matter into constituent atoms while leaving the ridge's mineral structure intact for geological surveys that would follow in subsequent decades. But the psychic echo of their sacrifice would endure far longer. 17 souls who had chosen meaning over survival, loyalty over institutional convenience, brotherhood over the mathematics of acceptable loss. Former Psyker Lydia Voss felt their spirits merge in the moment before obliteration, a telepathic communion that transcended individual identity. 300 condemned souls speaking as one voice across the barriers between life and death. We were more than our brands. We were more than acceptable losses. We were Imperial soldiers who chose to be worthy of that title, and no tribunal's judgment could take that choice away. In the decades that followed, Gehenna Prime would be listed in Imperial records as a successful pacification operation, chaos corruption eliminated through coordinated military action with minimal casualties among regular forces. The 47th Penal Legion would appear in classified reports as acceptable losses sustained during reconnaissance operations. Their sacrifice reduced to statistical abstractions that revealed nothing about the courage they had shown or the principles they had died defending. But in the deeper vaults of the Inquisition, sealed records would preserve a different truth. Interrogator Califax, tasked with investigating the unusual psychic resonance that lingered around Golgotha Ridge, would document testimony from surviving Chaos cultists who spoke of Imperial soldiers whose faith had burned so brightly that it had disrupted warp-based rituals simply through proximity. These branded criminals had somehow achieved something that centuries of doctrinal purity had failed to accomplish. They had made the enemy afraid. The cathedral that the 47th had died protecting would yield archaeotech that would strengthen Imperial forces throughout the sector, ancient knowledge that would save millions of lives in subsequent campaigns against the forces of darkness. But the reports that celebrated this discovery would never mention the condemned souls whose sacrifice had made it possible, their names erased from official histories that preferred clean victories to complicated truths about institutional betrayal and individual courage. Yet in the barracks of penal legions across the galaxy, a story would begin to circulate among condemned souls who faced their own expendable deployments. They would speak in whispers of the 47th, of branded criminals who had proven that redemption came through conscious choice rather than institutional validation, that brotherhood could survive even when official support was withdrawn, that the Emperor's light could burn in hearts that tribunals had declared irredeemably corrupt. The story would change in the telling, as such stories do. Names would be forgotten, details would shift, but the essential truth would endure. On Golgotha Ridge, mercy had died when abandoned by those who claimed authority over it. But courage, loyalty, and human dignity had survived the mathematics of acceptable loss. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war and the grinding machinery of institutions that reduced human souls to statistical abstractions, 17 condemned souls had chosen to be remembered as soldiers rather than casualties, as brothers rather than acceptable losses, as human beings whose brands marked their flesh but could never touch the courage that burned in their hearts. The Emperor's light had shone through the cracks in absolute certainty, revealing truths that doctrine was never designed to address. And in that light, for one brief moment on a forgotten world, mercy lived again in the actions of those whom society had condemned as unworthy of it. Their names were not recorded in the Chronicles of heroes. Their deeds were classified in reports that would never see public acknowledgement. But in the hearts of condemned souls across the galaxy, they lived on as proof that even the damned could choose redemption. Even the branded could find brotherhood. Even the expendable could die with meaning that transcended the mathematics of institutional convenience. The 47th Penal Legion had faced the ultimate test of faith, not faith in institutions that had betrayed them, but faith in each other, in the principles they chose to defend, in the simple truth that every soul has worth regardless of the brands that mark its flesh. And they had passed that test, written in blood and courage on the slopes of Golgotha Ridge, where mercy died but humanity endured. The Emperor protects. More stories await.